One of the most common questions I get from people looking to buy a laundromat is, how do I value this business? My name is Kira Hamilton. I'm an SBA loan broker and a former laundromat owner. In this video, I'm going to go over the 3 steps to valuing a laundromat. And at the end, I'm going to give you a special game-changing bonus tip that you won't want to miss. Most of the information in this video actually applies to small businesses in general, but I'll be using laundromats as my example since I've bought, operated, and sold a laundromat. So let's get into it. You want to buy a laundromat or another small business, but you obviously don't want to overpay. You want to make sure that you're getting a fair deal. So how do you value the business? Well, here's the truth, and some of you aren't going to like to hear this, but it is the truth. The value of a business is what someone is willing to pay for it. Now, you're going to find calculators online that will take into account the lease terms and the age of the equipment and the revenue, etc. And all of these are important factors when looking at a business and deciding what you're willing to pay for it. But the fact of the matter is, it's not a perfect science. There's not some magic objective number out there that completely decides what this business is worth. So really, I encourage you to think about this in a more nuanced way. Instead of trying to get to this perfect objective number, think instead, what are you able and willing to pay for this business? One of the main factors that impacts how a seller values their business and how you approach negotiations is what type of offer the seller is accepting. If they are accepting SBA offers, and if they know it's likely they are going to need to find an SBA buyer, then this puts some constraints on the situation that can be helpful to you as a buyer. Because with SBA, things become a little more clear-cut. We know the SBA lenders are typically going to do a 3-year look back. So they're going to look 3 years into the past of the business and make sure that there's an appropriate debt service coverage ratio. They're going to take the cash flow of the business and divide it by the annual debt service, depending on the purchase price of the business, to determine the DSCR. And most lenders are going to want to see at least a 1.2 DSCR in the past 3 years and in the current year. So again, when you're dealing with SBA, this can become a negotiating point, because if the seller knows they need to find an SBA buyer, then it's easier to go to them and say, hey, this thing isn't cash flowing. I can't get a lender to back me at this price point. Here's why, here's how we broke this down. But hey, at this price point, then this cash flow is enough and I can make this deal work. Now you have a piece of leverage. Now here's what's important to understand about laundromats. And again, this does really apply to small businesses in general, but there are a lot of laundromats that are being sold for under $500,000. And at that price point, sellers know that there's a good chance they can get a cash offer. I sold my laundromat for $300,000 to a cash buyer, and we had multiple buyers interested in the laundromat who were able to show proof of funds to pay all cash. I think once you get above $500,000, you are more likely to be competing with other people who are planning to use debt to buy the business. Now, there are definitely private equity firms buying up Main Street businesses, but I think most of the buyers in this space are individuals. And again, once you get over $500,000, it's just less likely you're going to find an individual or even a private equity firm who's going to pay all cash, because people and firms like the idea of leverage. We tend to think of debt as a dirty word, but when used in the right way, it's a really positive thing. People like to have cash on hand. Even if they have $750,000 cash, they don't necessarily want to spend all of that towards a business acquisition. So you're more likely to see for these smaller businesses, especially those that are being sold under $500,000, sellers are more likely to only be accepting cash offers because they know that it's likely they can find a buyer who can bring cash to the table. For cash deals, this can change how sellers are valuing their business, because they know they don't have to meet certain requirements set by SBA or even conventional lenders, and so they're not constrained in the same way. Whether you're planning to use cash or an SBA loan, here's what you need to do to decide on an appropriate value for the business. Step 1, determine how much money you need to make for this deal to be worth it to you. I think sometimes people can get caught up in, is this a good deal or is this a bad deal? And I think what's more helpful to think about is this the right deal for you? Because what might be a great deal for one person might be a terrible deal for another person. It really depends on your resources. What amount of money do you have to put into this project? What amount of time do you have to put into this project? What do you want your life to look like after you've bought this business? And does this particular business fit into the life vision that you have? So it's really important to understand what it's going to be like when you are operating this business. And of course, it's impossible to know the future. You're really not going to know exactly what it's like until you do it. But I think that it's helpful to focus on that aspect of the transaction and not just focus on the financials. Remember, you're going to be operating this thing. If you're buying one laundromat or even one of any other type of small business, most likely you're not going to have the cash flow for a quality full-time manager. You're going to be operating it. So you want to understand what that's going to look like in the day-to-day. Ask the sellers a lot of questions about what they're currently doing and go and visit the laundromat. Go do a load of laundry a few times throughout the week on different days and at different times and get a feel for the place. Check out what the employees are doing, see what the customer experience is like. Obviously, don't make it clear that you are there assessing the business. You don't want to let employees know that you're interested in buying it. Sellers want to have the opportunity to share that information when it's right for them. So you've got to do the best you can to figure out how much work you're going to be putting into this business, and then make a personal decision for yourself of how much money you need to be making for that to be worth it to you. Of course, how you finance the transaction matters as well. Obviously, if you are going to have a monthly loan payment, you need to factor that in and consider after you pay your debt, what would you have left over, and is that amount worth it to you? If you're using an SBA loan to buy the business, it's really not just about how much money you want to be making at the end of the day. The SBA lender is also going to have an opinion on that. They're going to want to see that you're making a certain amount of money so that they feel comfortable that you're going to be able to repay the debt. If you're paying cash, you'll want to think how quickly you need to make that money back for this transaction to make sense to you. Of course, you can factor into this the potential of the business in the future. There's no guarantee that you're going to be able to grow the business, but if you see potential there, for example, if you're buying a self-service laundromat and you plan to add a wash and fold service and there's not a ton of wash and fold competition in the area, you could see a significant revenue increase by adding that service to the business. That is, of course, going to add more work on your part as the owner, but if you are down to put in that time and effort to grow a wash and fold service, it can be profitable. So that might be part of your calculation too. I think it's good to determine the minimum amount you would accept, the minimum amount you'd have to make each month at the end of the day after all your expenses are paid, including a potential loan payment, because then I think it can make the negotiating process a little faster and easier. Because then at a certain point, if you can't get above that minimum, then it's time to move on and look at other deals. I like this approach and this mindset of thinking, what do I need to get from this for it to work for me? Because it places the emphasis more on, is this business the right fit for you? Rather than, like I said, some magic objective number about how businesses are valued, because the truth is, it is subjective. I'm an SBA loan broker. I love SBA loans. And I think if a seller is accepting an SBA offer, that gives you some negotiating power. But to be honest, it can be tough to buy laundromats with SBA loans. Check out my video linked above to learn why. Step 2, make sure you accurately understand the financials of the business. You want to understand and verify the revenue and expenses as much as you can, because Sure, you've determined the number that you need to make for this to all be worth it to you, but then of course you have to make sure that it's realistic that you're going to be able to make that particular number. When you're looking at the financials, you want to have an understanding of the SDE, or seller's discretionary earnings. If you're not familiar with that term, I've got a whole video breaking it down, so be sure to check it out. If you are using an SBA loan, this is going to be an important number. It's going to be part of the calculation that lenders do to determine your debt service coverage ratio. But even if you're using cash, this is a helpful number to understand and an important metric to use. Most small businesses are valued based on a multiple of the SDE, usually somewhere between 3 to 5 times, with smaller businesses usually at the smaller end of that. You may even see small businesses valued at 2 to 3 times the SDE. So it's important to understand this metric, and it's important language to use when you're negotiating with the seller. If you dig into the financials and then you realize the seller is trying to sell at a 10x of the SDE, that's not a very reasonable ask, and it's unlikely that they're going to be able to sell at that price. You can use that as a negotiating point. Before you get into any negotiations, make sure you understand how the seller came up with their asking price. They may put this explanation out there to begin with. They may provide a spreadsheet with a calculation of their SDE, or their seller's discretionary earnings, and they may make the multiple very clear. Or they may not. If it's not clear how they came up with their asking price, it's okay to ask, hey, can you tell me about how you came up with this asking price? How are you valuing this business? What information are you basing this on? And then really listen to what they have to say. Their answer to this question can reveal a lot about their thought process, and you can use that information later in your negotiations. If you can, I always recommend getting the tax returns as soon as possible. Many times, sellers and brokers won't provide these until you've signed an LOI, but if you can get them before that stage, it's really helpful. If you are using an SBA loan to buy this business, SBA lenders are going to be underwriting to the tax returns, so you want to get those documents as quickly as possible so you can get feedback early on in the process. One of the biggest things that is important to get to the bottom of is how much time the owner is spending working in the business. The reason this is so important is, one, because you want to understand what you're stepping into. Again, if we go back to step one, determining what you're willing to pay for it, a big piece of that is, well, how much work is this business going to be for me? If you think about, what each hour of your time is worth, it's important to understand what the current owner is doing, because you're either going to need to step into that, or you're going to need to hire someone to do that work, and that's going to be an expense. Now, the reason this can be easy to miss is because depending on how the owner has their business structured, there might not be a line item for their work. When you look at the wages of the laundromat, they may just be showing the wage expense they're paying their employees with. They may not be showing a salary line item. That may just be included already in their SDE calculation. To be honest, this is going to be one of those things that's hard to perfectly verify. How do you exactly verify how much someone is working on their business? There's not really documentation to back that up. Really, you have to go based on their word. And this is where it's really important to do a vibe check of the seller. I think this is one of the most overlooked parts of due diligence is, what is your rapport like with the seller? I think when you're not getting a good vibe from someone, when they don't seem forthright and transparent. If I were looking at a business to buy, and even if the financials looked fantastic and the business seemed like a good fit for me, but I wasn't getting a good feeling from the seller, I'm probably not moving forward with that transaction, because as someone who has sold a business, I know there are things that sellers can hide. So if you're not getting a good feeling from the seller, check in with yourself and really ask yourself if you want to move forward. Step 3, plan ahead for expenses. The biggest capital expense you're going to have when it comes to laundromats is, you probably guessed it, the equipment. Equipment can get expensive. A few months after I bought my laundromat, I needed to buy 2 new 40-pound washers. The cost of the machines and the installation was $21,000. Now, equipment can have a pretty long lifespan. You can have laundry equipment that lasts for 20 to 25 years. I had dryers that when I bought the business were about 20 years old, and they were still chugging just fine. And every few months, I needed to spend a couple $100s doing some repairs. It really wasn't that bad. So it's possible that you have laundry equipment that lasts longer than 20 years, if you're taking care of it well. But I do like to plan for the worst case scenario. So I always advise people, if you are looking to buy a laundromat and any of the equipment is 15 years or older, get a cost to replace it. Most distributors have a financing department, so you can go to them and say, I'm looking to buy this laundromat. I'm thinking I may need to replace this type of equipment in the next few years. Can I get a quote for it? And can I see what the monthly loan payment on that would look like? You should then factor that loan payment into your cash flow analysis and use that as part of determining how much you would need to make for this to be worth it to you. Because if you've said, I need to make X amount of dollars for this to be worth it to me, and as you have the deal structured, you're just meeting that, but then you look at this loan estimate and you say, okay, well, if these 10 machines go out in the next few years, that might dramatically impact how much you're making, and that may change what you need the deal to look like in order for it to be worth it to you. If you want to be really conservative, you could get a quote for machines that are 10 years or older, but I think 15 years or older is a safe place to start. Okay, so let's review. First, you have done a personal analysis of how much money you would need to be making from this particular business based on how much time, effort, and money you'll be putting into the investment for the whole thing to be worth it for you. You have looked carefully at the financials. You've taken the time to understand how the seller has come to their valuation. You really spent the time listening to them and finding out as much information as you can. You've gotten a hold of the tax returns if you can. You've made sure that you understand the SDE calculation and how much time they are spending in the business. You then looked ahead and you've thought, what expenses may come up equipment-wise in the next 5 years that might affect my cash flow. Now, once you've done all this, it's time to get into negotiating. Now for my bonus tip. You're going to get this book and read it cover to cover. I read this book before selling my laundromat, and I can say these strategies actually work. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for more content on laundromats and other small businesses. And if you're interested in one-on-one laundromat consultations, or if you're interested in discussing financing options for your next acquisition, check out the links in my show notes to see how you can get in touch with me.